The telegram that arrived at the sheriff's office in Laredo, Texas on a blazing Tuesday in June of 1879 was passed from hand to hand like something contagious, each man who read it laughing a little too hard before setting it down and backing away as though the paper itself might bite. Sheriff Dale Connors read it twice, tucked it into his vest pocket, and walked straight to the saloon, where he ordered a whiskey before noon for the first time in 11 years of service. The telegram had come from up north, from a cattle rancher named Hector Beale in the town of Dusty Creek, just outside of Abilene, Kansas. Hector was the kind of man who wrote letters with great ceremony and extreme economy of sympathy. He had sent the message on behalf of the surrounding territory, which was something of an exaggeration, but nobody in 5 counties was willing to contradict him. The message read as follows: one woman, named Sarah Sawyer, 24 years old, runs her late father's spread on the eastern ridge of Dusty Creek. Has driven off 3 hired foremen, caused 2 deputy marshals to resign their badges, and last Thursday horsewhipped a card cheat through the main street of town without so much as a how do you do. No man in this territory is willing to take her on as wife, partner, or employee. If you know anyone who wants her, send word. We are running out of patience. Sheriff Connors stared into his whiskey and thought about the only man he knew who might receive such a telegram and not run. Eli Sullivan was 28 years old, stood 6 feet and 1 inch tall, and had spent the better part of his adult life ranching the hill country south of San Antonio before a bad drought and a worse business partner had sent him north in search of new land. He had arrived in Laredo 3 weeks prior with a horse, a bedroll, $200, and a reputation for being the most quietly unshakable man in a 2-state region. Cowboys respected him. Horses trusted him. Mean dogs stopped growling when he looked at them. He had been engaged once, to a gentle schoolteacher in Fredericksburg, and the engagement had ended not because of any cruelty, but because the woman had told him plainly that she needed a man who would raise his voice sometimes, and he had smiled and said he understood, and he had ridden away without bitterness. He was sitting on the front porch of the rooming house when Connors found him, whittling a piece of cedar into something that was beginning to resemble a horse. Connors handed him the telegram without a word. Eli read it once, then he read it again. Then he set down the cedar horse and the whittling knife and looked out across the brown dust of the street, where a pair of longhorns were being moved past by a boy who looked no older than 14. "You know anything else about her?" Eli asked. "Heard she can rope a steer faster than most men and shoots better than most deputies," Connors said. "Heard her father raised her alone after her mother passed when she was 8. Raised her like he would have raised a son because he only had the one child and the ranch didn't care what kind of hands were working it. What happened to the father? Died 2 years back. Heart gave out. Left her everything, which is about 400 acres, a herd of beef cattle, and apparently a temperament that could strip paint off a barn door." Eli picked up the cedar horse again and turned it over in his hands. "Tell them I'm coming," he said. Connors blinked. "You understand what you're riding into." "I understand a woman who runs her own ranch has been reduced to a telegram sent around like a joke," Eli said, and there was something in his voice that was quiet and certain, and not at all like a man who was being reckless. "Yeah, tell them I'm coming." The ride from Laredo to Abilene took Eli Sullivan the better part of 2 weeks, following the cattle trails north through the hill country, crossing the Colorado River at a shallow ford outside of Austin, and then pushing northeast through the rolling Blackland Prairie as June gave way to the heavy heat of July. His horse was a deep chestnut quarter horse he'd named Copper, and Copper was the kind of animal that could read a man's mood and adjust accordingly, which meant that for most of the journey he walked with long, unhurried strides, as if he too understood that arriving in the right frame of mind mattered more than arriving quickly. Eli spent those 2 weeks thinking about what he was riding toward, and he was honest enough with himself to admit that the telegram had not repelled him. Something in the language of it had caught at something in him, some instinct that recognized not danger but injustice. A woman who had been described as too fierce for any man in the territory was a woman who had simply refused to be smaller than she was, and he had grown up watching his own mother be asked to be smaller every single day of her life, until she finally obliged, and the diminishment of her had been the quiet tragedy of his childhood. He arrived in Dusty Creek on a Wednesday afternoon in mid-July, riding down the main street through a haze of red dust that floated above the road like a thin curtain. The town was modest, built with the practical hopefulness of a frontier settlement that expected to grow but hadn't quite managed it yet. There was a general store, a livery stable, a post office, a saloon called the Iron Spoke, a small church at the far end of the street, and a scattering of houses and commercial buildings in between. A wooden water tower stood at the northern edge of town, and two windmills turned lazily in the hot afternoon air. People looked at him the way people in small towns always looked at a stranger with curiosity sharpened by geography. Everyone knew everyone here, and a new face was always either news or trouble. He stopped at the livery stable first, because a man who didn't take care of his horse before himself wasn't worth much in Eli's estimation. The liveryman was a stocky fellow with a red beard and an expression of permanent skepticism. His name, he said, was Otto Crane. Passing through. Otto asked, taking Copper's reins with a practiced ease that told Eli he was good with animals. Looking for a spread on the eastern ridge, Eli said. Saw your land. Otto's expression changed. Not dramatically, but unmistakably. His eyes went a fraction wider and his chin pulled back like a man who had just smelled something unexpected. You the one who sent word from down south? Otto asked. Eli Sullivan. Yes. Otto looked him up and down with the frank appraisal of a man who had no reason to be polite about it. He was measuring Eli against some interior expectation, and whatever conclusion he reached, he kept it behind his red beard. I'll look after your horse, Otto said finally. The Sawyer place is about 3 miles east. Follow the ridge road past the creek crossing and you'll see the gate. There's a painted S on the post, though the paint's gone a little thin. Is she there now? Sarah Sawyer is always there, Otto said, and there was something in the way he said it that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite complaint. She doesn't go many places she doesn't need to go. Eli thanked him and arranged to collect Copper in the morning, then went to the post office to see about a place to stay. The postmistress, a small, alert woman named Mrs. Gruber, told him the boarding house 2 doors down had a room available and gave him such a thorough look of assessment that he felt as though he had been read like a letter. You're here about Sarah Sawyer, Mrs. Gruber said. It wasn't a question. I am. She won't make it easy. I'm not looking for easy, Eli said. Mrs. Gruber tilted her head slightly, like a bird considering something from a new angle, and then she smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. No, she said quietly, almost to herself. I don't imagine you are. He went to the boarding house, took his room, washed the trail dust from his face and hands at the basin, and sat on the narrow bed for a few minutes with his hat in his hands, thinking. He was aware that he was about to ride out to a woman who had not asked for him, who did not know him, and who had been made into something of a local legend by the frustrations and failures of men who had not been up to her particular measure. He was also aware that he had traveled 600 miles on the strength of a second-hand telegram, which was either the most rational thing he had ever done or the most irrational, and he couldn't quite determine which. What he was certain of was this: he would not go to her as a man going to collect a difficult animal. He would go to her as a man going to meet a woman who had been done a considerable disservice and who deserved to be met honestly. He set out the next morning just after sunrise, while the air still carried the thin coolness of night. He'd borrowed a bay mare from Otto's stable to ride out, since Copper was still resting, and the mare was gentle and easy, picking her way along the ridge road with calm efficiency. The country out here was beautiful in the early morning, the grass rolling in slow golden waves on either side of the road, the sky enormous and pale blue above the distant line of the cottonwoods that marked the creek. Hawks turned high overhead in patient circles, and the smell of sage was sharp and clean in the morning air. He found the gate with the faded painted S and turned down the lane that led toward the Sawyer Ranch. The land here was well kept, he noticed immediately. The fence lines were straight and maintained. The grass in the near pastures showed the careful rotation of a herd being managed with attention. A kitchen garden ran along the south side of the main house, and even from a distance he could see the straight rows of it, the staked tomato plants and the leafy sprawl of squash. The house itself was a solid two-story timber structure, weathered to a warm gray silver, with a covered porch running across the front. A barn stood some 100 yards behind it, and beyond the barn he could see the movement of cattle in a far pasture, their dark shapes slow against the gold of the grass. He tied the mare to the post at the gate of the yard and walked toward the porch. She came around the side of the house before he reached the steps, and she stopped when she saw him. Sarah Sawyer was not what he had expected, and yet she was exactly what he should have expected if he had thought about it more carefully. She was tall for a woman, perhaps 5 feet and 7 inches, lean with the kind of muscle that came from real work rather than performance. She was wearing canvas trousers tucked into worn boots, a loose cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and a battered hat that had seen better decades. Her hair was dark brown, pulled back in a practical knot at the back of her neck, with pieces escaping around her face in the morning heat. Her eyes were an unusual shade, something between gray and green, sharp and direct as a blade. She was holding a length of rope in one hand, coiled halfway through some task of mending, and she looked at him with an expression that was neither hostile nor welcoming but completely assessing and entirely unimpressed. "You're trespassing," she said. Her voice was lower than he had imagined, clear and direct. "My name is Eli Sullivan," he said. "I rode ahead." "I know who you are," she said. "I didn't say you couldn't write. I said you're trespassing." "I'll leave if you ask me to," he said. "I want to be clear about that from the beginning. I didn't come here to push myself where I'm not wanted. I came because something about that telegram bothered me and I wanted to see for myself what the situation was." She stared at him for a long moment. The rope continued its slow revolution in her hands, as if her fingers kept working independently of whatever her mind was doing. "What bothered you about it?" she said. "The language of it," he said. "Describing a woman as something that needs to be gotten rid of." Another long pause. Something shifted in her expression, not warmth, not yet, but something like a door that was neither opening nor closing. "You want coffee," she said finally. "Yes, ma'am, I would appreciate that." "Don't call me ma'am, my name is Sarah." "All right, Sarah, I'm Eli." She turned and walked toward the front door without waiting to see if he followed, and he took that as permission and followed her. The inside of the house was spare and functional and deeply lived in. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room. There were bookshelves along one wall, which surprised him pleasantly, 2 full shelves of books, more than he had seen in most homes in the territory. The furniture was practical and solid, built for use rather than display. The kitchen was off the main room, and she went directly to the stove where a pot of coffee was already keeping warm, and she poured 2 cups without ceremony and set them on the wooden table. He sat across from her and wrapped both hands around the cup and breathed in the steam. It was good coffee, strong and dark, the way working people made it. "How much did Hector Beale tell you?" she asked. Her eyes were on him over the rim of her cup, steady and watchful. "He said you'd run off 3 foremen and made 2 deputies resign." "Those are true," she said, without apology or explanation. "He said you horsewhipped a card cheat through Main Street." "That is also true," she said. "He had taken $60 from the widow Callahan with a marked deck. She is 71 years old, and that money was 3 months of her savings. I returned it to her." Eli nodded slowly. "What did the deputies object to?" "One of them wanted me to stop carrying a firearm because he said it made men nervous," she said. "I told him that if the sight of a woman exercising her right to protect her property made men nervous, the problem was with the men. He filed a report saying I was a disruption to public order. The other one took issue with my handling of a dispute about water rights on the south boundary of my property. He sided with the man who had no legal claim because the man was a friend of his, and I told him in front of 7 witnesses that he was corrupt. He resigned rather than face an inquiry. Eli drank his coffee and said nothing for a moment. "And the foreman?" he asked. Something crossed her face then, a flash of something that might have been old pain, quickly recontained. "The first one thought the job came with certain expectations that I hadn't agreed to," she said carefully. "He was mistaken, and he left. The second one undermined my decisions in front of the hands and tried to run the ranch as though I wasn't there. I don't employ men who refuse to acknowledge who signs their wages. The third one was actually a good foreman, and he left because his wife wanted to go back to Missouri, and that had nothing to do with me at all, but Beal told it differently." Eli set his cup down. "I see," he said. "Do you?" She looked at him with that direct gray-green gaze that felt like being looked through. "Because what most people see is a difficult woman." "What I see," Eli said carefully, "is a woman who owns and runs a functioning cattle operation of 400 acres, alone, at 24, who has been holding her own against every kind of obstacle, and who has been made into a warning rather than a credit." The silence that followed that was different from the silences before it. It had a texture to it that hadn't been there before. Sarah Sawyer looked at him for a long, still moment, and something in her face moved in a way that was very small but very real, like the first shift of ice at the end of winter. "What is it you want here, Eli Sullivan?" she said. "I need land," he said honestly. "I had a ranch in the hill country. Lost it to drought and a bad partnership. I've been working my way north looking for a new start. When I read that telegram, I thought that maybe there was something here worth considering. But I want to be clear, I'm not here to take anything from you. If there's no arrangement that makes sense for both of us, I'll say goodbye and ride on, and I won't hold it against anyone." "What kind of arrangement?" she said. "That depends on what you need," he said. "You need help working this land." "I need land to work. There are different ways that equation could resolve itself. I'm not going to tell you what those ways are because you're the one who's been running this operation and you understand it better than I do." Sarah set her cup down very precisely in the center of the table and looked at him. "You're a strange man," she said. "I've been told that." "I'll give you a week's trial," she said. "Room and board in the bunkhouse. Standard wages if you decide to stay on as a hand, but I run this ranch. My word is final on this property." "That sounds agreeable to me," he said. "Don't think it means anything else," she said, and her voice carried an edge that he recognized as armor rather than hostility, the voice of someone who had been misread too many times. "I understand," he said. "It means I have a job for a week, nothing more unless we both decide otherwise." She picked up her cup again and looked out the window at the morning light spreading across her pastures. "You can start this afternoon," she said. "The south fence line needs riding, 2 posts down after the last storm." "I'll take care of it," he said. He rose, thanked her for the coffee, and walked back out into the July morning. And as he did, he felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time, not quite certainty, but something close to it. The feeling of being exactly where he was supposed to be. He spent that first afternoon on the south fence line and found not 2 down posts but 4, along with a section of wire that had worked loose from 3 posts and needed resetting. He did the work methodically and well, without rushing, taking the time to do it right. The land here was good land. He could see that plainly. The grass was healthy, the soil held moisture in the lower places, and the cattle he'd passed in the afternoon heat were well fed and easy. Someone had been managing this property with consistent intelligence, and that someone was Sarah Sawyer. He came back to the main yard at dusk to find her in the barn finishing the evening feeding, and he reported the fence work without embellishment. She listened, asked one question about the south corner post specifically, and nodded when he described how he had anchored it. "The corner's been trouble since last spring," she said. "The ground shifts there in the wet season. You might think about driving a secondary post 6 inches to the east," he said. share the load. She looked at him with that considering expression that he was already coming to recognize. That would work, she said, as if the admission cost her something. I'll have one of the hands do it. I can do it tomorrow if you'd like, he said. She turned back to the feed bin. Suit yourself. He ate supper with the two ranch hands that evening in the bunkhouse. Their names were Clem and Jesse, and they were both older than he was. Clem in his mid-40s, Jesse perhaps 50, both weathered and laconic in the way of men who had worked outdoors their whole lives. They received him with the watchful courtesy of men who were not yet sure about him but were willing to wait and see. She send you back already? Clem asked by way of greeting. No, Eli said. She gave me a week. Clem and Jesse exchanged a look that contained a great deal of unspoken communication. That's more than most get, Jesse said finally. What did most do wrong? Eli asked. Tried to change things, Clem said simply. The way things run here works. Some men can't stand that the person running it is a woman. They start suggesting, then recommending, then insisting. By that point they're already gone, they just don't know it yet. I'm not here to change anything, Eli said. I'm here to work. Another exchange of looks between the two older men, this one slightly different in character. Then you might last, Jesse said, and handed him the bread basket. The first week passed in the deep physical rhythm of ranch work, and Eli moved through it the way he moved through everything, quietly, thoroughly, with a focus that had nothing of show in it. He fixed the fence posts. He helped move the north herd to the summer pasture. He repaired a section of the barn roof that had been losing shingles since winter. He rose before the sun and was rarely in the bunkhouse before the stars came out. Sarah watched him the way a hawk watches something interesting on the ground, from a distance, with great attention, without swooping. She was present every day, working alongside her hands with the same unreserved commitment to labor that Eli himself had, and occasionally their work would bring them into proximity, and they would work together with a growing ease that neither of them remarked upon but both of them noticed. On the fourth day, he was in the barn reshaping a bent wheel rim when she came in to doctor one of the mares that had gone slightly lame. He watched her work without making it obvious, the way she handled the animal with absolute confidence and complete gentleness, her hands moving over the horse's leg with a knowledge that was plainly deep and carefully earned. The mare stood quiet for her, which told Eli everything he needed to know about how Sarah Sawyer dealt with animals that trusted her. You're good with horses, he said when she had finished wrapping the leg. My father taught me, she said. He said there was nothing a horse knew about you that wasn't true. That's right, Eli said. She looked at him. What does mine say about you? He was quiet for a moment. Copper, he'd say I'm steady, maybe a little stubborn. Most people who are steady are a little stubborn, she said. It's what makes them steady. He smiled at that, not a polished smile, just the real kind, the kind that moved through a person and showed before they could decide about it. She caught it and looked away, and he thought he saw the shadow of something at the corner of her own mouth. On the fifth day, there was a dispute. A man named Russell Greer rode up to the south gate in the early afternoon. A broad-shouldered, red-faced man in his late 30s, who ran a competing cattle operation 2 ridges over, and who had a long-standing argument with Sarah over the boundaries of the water access along the creek that ran between their properties. Eli was mending tack in the yard when Greer rode in, and he stayed where he was and watched. Sarah came out of the house with the same unhurried directness with which she did everything, and she stood at the top of her porch steps and waited. Sawyer, Greer said, not getting down from his horse, which was a deliberate rudeness. I'm telling you for the last time that north branch of Pigeon Creek is mine to the center line, and your herd has been crossing it. The water rights to Pigeon Creek North Branch were established by the survey of 1871, Sarah said. Her voice was perfectly even. Which gives me use to the eastern bank, which is this side. My cattle are grazing to the eastern bank. If your cattle are also using the eastern bank, that's a matter you need to address with your own herd. Don't quote surveys at me, Greer said, his voice rising. I'm telling you, you'd better get your herd back or I'll start cutting wire." "If you cut my wire," Sarah said, "I will report you to the county land agent and have your water claim reviewed in its entirety. I have the survey document. I have the original title transfer. And I have 3 witnesses who will confirm where my cattle have been grazing." Greer's face had gone the color of a boiled beet. He looked at Eli, who had continued mending tack without interrupting. "Who's this?" Greer demanded. "He's one of my hands," Sarah said. "You taking in strays now?" Greer said, and the contempt in his voice was wide enough to cover both of them. Eli set down the piece of harness he was working on and stood up slowly, not quickly, not with aggression, just with the particular quality of stillness that very large, very calm men have when they choose to be present in a situation. He didn't say anything. He simply looked at Greer with an expression that was entirely pleasant and completely inflexible. Greer looked between the two of them, recalculated something, and swung his horse around. "This isn't finished," he said to Sarah. "It will be if you cut my wire," she said. "Good afternoon, Mr. Greer." He rode out. The dust settled behind him. Sarah watched him go with the expression of someone who had been through this particular exchange many times and was tired of it without being frightened of it. She looked at Eli. "Thank you for not interfering," she said. "It wasn't my fight to interfere in," he said. "You handled it." Most men would have stepped forward the moment he raised his voice. "I don't see what good that would have done," Eli said. "You were winning." She was quiet for a moment, and this time what moved across her face was less guarded, a little warmer. "The survey document is real," she said. "He knows it's real. He tests me about it every few months to see if I'll flinch. And you never do." "No," she said simply. "I never do." That evening after supper, Eli sat on the bunkhouse step in the cooling dark and Clem sat beside him, and they looked out at the stars that were appearing one by one in the vast Texas sky above Kansas. "She's going to offer you the job full time," Clem said. "Probably tomorrow." "How do you know?" "Because she watched you not interfere with Greer today, and that was the last test," Clem said. "Everything else this week was just to see if you could work. Today was to see if you understood what kind of operation this is." Eli turned his hat over in his hands. "What do you think about it?" he asked. "About what?" "About me staying." Clem was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. "I think this ranch needs someone who can stand beside her rather than in front of her," Clem said. "And I think that might be the first time I've said that about anyone in the 3 years I've been working here." Eli nodded slowly. "She's something," he said, and he wasn't talking about difficulty or fierceness or any of the words that had been used in that telegram. He was talking about something else entirely, and Clem heard it, and the older man smiled to himself in the dark. She offered him the position the next morning, as predicted, before he had finished his first cup of coffee. She was at the kitchen table with her ranch ledger open in front of her, and she laid out the terms plainly and practically, the wages, the responsibilities, the scope of the role, and then she looked at him and waited. "I'll take it," he said, "on one condition." Her chin lifted slightly. "I don't negotiate conditions," she said. "This is less a condition than a clarification," he said. "I want to be clear that I'm here to work this land, not to manage you. I'm not interested in ever being the kind of hand who thinks the boss needs supervision." Something shifted in her eyes, a releasing of something held. "That's a clarification I can accept," she said. "Then I accept the position," he said. She extended her hand across the table and he shook it, and it was a firm handshake, strong and direct, the handshake of someone who had been doing business her whole life and expected to be taken seriously. As July gave way to August, Eli settled into the life of the Sawyer Ranch with a completeness that surprised even him. The work was good and varied and demanding, and he threw himself into it with the full commitment of a man who had found a place worth being. He developed an easy working relationship with Clem and Jesse, who had accepted him with increasing warmth as the weeks passed. He learned the particular rhythms of the land here, the way the north pasture held water after a rain, the temperament of the various cattle in the herd, which section of fence was most vulnerable to pressure from the northern drift of the herd in summer. And he learned Sarah Sawyer. Not quickly and not easily, because she was not a woman who gave herself away in small increments. She had been shaped by years of being her own only reliable resource, and the walls she had built were not made of hostility but of self-sufficiency, which was in some ways harder to breach because it required not force but patience, not insistence but presence. He was patient. He was present. He noticed things. He noticed that she read every evening after supper if there wasn't pressing work, usually sitting in the chair nearest the window to catch the last of the light, holding the book with both hands and going completely still with attention in a way she never was during the day. He noticed that she was quieter on Sundays than on other days, and after 3 weeks he understood why, because her father's grave was in the small fenced plot at the eastern edge of the property, and Sunday was when she went there. He noticed that she had a sense of humor that was dry and quick, and usually deployed so quietly that you could miss it if you weren't paying attention. He noticed that she was almost violently fair, that her sense of justice was not abstract or theoretical but personal and immediate, the kind that comes from having been on the wrong side of it too many times. He noticed that when she was working through a problem, she went silent and walked, covering ground with long deliberate strides while her mind worked, and that the best thing to do was either walk beside her and say nothing, or wait until she came back. He learned to walk beside her and say nothing, and this turned out to be something she had not expected from anyone. "You don't fill the silence," she said one afternoon in late August, when they had been walking the perimeter of the West pasture together, and she had been quiet for 20 minutes working through a question about the fall roundup. "I never saw the point in filling silence just for the sake of filling it," he said. "Most people find silence uncomfortable," she said. "Most people are afraid of their own thoughts," he said. "I don't happen to be." She glanced at him sideways with those gray-green eyes. "What do you think about," she said, "when you're quiet?" "Right now I'm thinking about the West pasture," he said. "Whether you'd consider moving the roundup to mid-September this year based on the condition of the grass, but that's your call." She looked out at the grass in question. "Why mid-September?" "The south section is carrying a little thin through the heat. If you push the roundup back 2 weeks, it'll have time to recover before the fall driving conditions, and the steers going to market will have had more time on the good northern grass. They'll weigh better." She was quiet for a moment. "The same thought occurred to me last week," she said. "I figured it might have," he said. "I just wanted to say it in case it was useful." She stopped walking and looked at him directly, and there was something different in her face, something that was not guarded and not calculating but simply and quietly wondering. "Who are you, Eli Sullivan?" she said. It came out like a question she hadn't planned to ask, and for a moment she looked startled by her own directness. "I'm just a man who needed good land to work," he said, "and found it." She looked at him for a long beat, and then she looked away over the rolling west pasture and he saw her breath move, and he thought he understood that what he had said had reached her, not as flattery, but as truth. She moved the roundup to mid-September. It was at the beginning of September that Hector Beale came to call. He arrived on a Thursday morning with his son-in-law beside him, a younger man named Carl who had the look of someone who had been told for so long that he was important that he had stopped questioning it. Beale himself was a large, gray-haired man in his late 60s, with a rancher's hard hands and a politician's careful mouth, and he surveyed the yard of the Sawyer Ranch with the proprietary air of a man who considered he had some claim on everything he looked at. Eli was in the yard when they rode up, and he watched them come through the gate with the quiet attention he gave to most things. Sarah appeared on the porch before they had dismounted. "Hector," she said. Her voice was even, but Eli, who had been learning her for 6 weeks now, heard the tightening in it. "Sarah," Beale said, stepping down from his horse with a grunt. "I see you've taken in that fellow from down south. I've employed a ranch hand," she said. "Yes." Beale looked at Eli with the frank displeasure of a man who disapproves of something but hasn't decided how to express it yet. "I'll speak plainly," Beale said, turning back to Sarah. My intention in sending that telegram was to help you. You're alone out here with no family, and this ranch is more than a woman ought to be managing solo. I've been managing it for 2 years, Sarah said. Not well enough, Beale said, and there was something deliberate and cutting in the way he said it. There have been complaints, the business with the card cheat in town, the water dispute with Greer. You've been creating friction, Sarah, and people are tired of it. The card cheat stole from a widow, Sarah said, and my water rights are documented in the county survey record. If that creates friction, the friction isn't coming from me. A woman running a ranch like a man, going against other ranchers in public disputes, carrying on like what? Sarah said, and now her voice had the quality of something very controlled over something very hot. Like someone who has forgotten her proper place, Beale said. The silence after that was absolute. Eli set down what he was doing and stood up, and this time he did step forward, not between Sarah and Beale, but to her side, and he stood there quietly and looked at Beale with an expression that was completely pleasant and utterly, immovably resolute. Her proper place, Eli said, is on the land her father left her, which she has been working and maintaining with skill and commitment for 2 years. I've been here 6 weeks, and I can tell you that this is one of the best managed operations in the territory. Beale looked at him with surprise and then with hostility. You're a hand, Beale said. You don't have standing to speak in this conversation. My name is Eli Sullivan, Eli said. I'm speaking as someone who has an opinion about what's happening in front of him. You can give that opinion whatever weight you like. Beale looked between Eli and Sarah, and his face had taken on the color of a man who has been quietly overturned and doesn't yet know how to manage it. I came out here with Carl because I thought there might be a reasonable conversation to be had about the future of this land, Beale said, his voice shifting tone into something that tried to be conciliatory. Carl is a capable man. He could help manage. No, Sarah said. The word was a door closing. Sarah, no, she said again. This land belongs to me. It is not available to be managed by Carl, by you, or by anyone else. I appreciate that you think you're helping. You are not helping. Good morning, Hector. Beale looked at her and then at Eli, and something in him seemed to understand that this conversation was completely over, and he put his hat back on and climbed back onto his horse. You're making a mistake, he said, to no one in particular. I'll note that, Sarah said. They rode out. Sarah stood on her porch for a moment after they left, and then she descended the steps and walked past Eli toward the barn without looking at him, and he understood that she needed a moment, and he let her have it. But a short while later she came back out of the barn and crossed the yard to where he was working again, and she stopped a few feet away and looked at him. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know, he said. I didn't need defending, she said, and there was something in her voice that was fierce, but also, under the fierceness, something more fragile. I know that too, he said. You were handling it. I spoke because I wanted to, not because I thought you needed me to. She looked at him for a long moment with those clear, direct eyes. Why did you want to? She said. He met her gaze steadily. Because someone should have been saying those things for a long time, he said. And I was standing there and I had the words. She looked away. The morning light was shifting across the yard, and somewhere in the south pasture one of the cattle lowed in the distance, and the windmill on the near hill turned in a slow, dry arc. My father would have liked you, she said quietly. It was the most personal thing she had said to him in 6 weeks, and it landed in him like light landing on water, not striking, but spreading. I think I would have liked him too, Eli said. She went back to work, and so did he, and neither of them said anything more about it, but something between them had changed, had moved, had shifted its footing in the particular way that real things shift when they start to become certain. September came in with a change in the weather, the brutal heat of summer breaking at last into something cleaner and drier, the evenings turning cool enough for a jacket, the mornings sharp and blue. The roundup began on the 14th, just as Sarah had planned, and it was 3 days of hard riding and hard work, moving cattle and cutting calves, and working through the whole herd with the systematic thoroughness of people who knew what they were doing. Eli worked beside Sarah and Clem and Jesse, and 2 extra hands hired for the occasion, and the work had a quality of purpose and collaboration that he had not felt in years. A team of people moving together toward something they all understood and valued. On the second evening of the roundup, after the cooking fire had burned down and Clem and Jesse had turned in, Eli and Sarah sat beside the remains of the fire in the cooling dark, and for the first time they talked without any practical purpose driving the conversation. She told him about her father. His name had been Joseph Sawyer, and he had brought her mother and a 6-month-old Sarah to this land in 1856, when this part of Kansas was barely settled, and the prairie went in every direction farther than a person could ride in a day. Her mother had died of fever when Sarah was 8, and Joseph Sawyer had looked at his daughter and made the decision, not a dramatic one, just a quiet, practical one, that he was going to raise her to be able to manage in the world as it was, not as it was supposed to be for women. "He taught me to ride before he taught me to cook," she said, smiling at the memory in a way that was entirely private and entirely real and the most unguarded thing he had seen on her face. "He said a woman who could ride could go anywhere, and anywhere was better than stuck." "He was right," Eli said. "He was right about most things," she said. "He wasn't perfect. He was stubborn, sometimes to the point of cutting off his own nose, but he was fair. He treated every person who came onto this land with the same basic dignity regardless of who they were. That's rarer than it should be." "It is," Eli agreed. She looked at the fire's embers. "He'd been sick for a year before he died," she said. "He kept working as long as he could. At the end, when he knew it was coming, he called me in and he said, Sarah, this land is yours and no one can take it from you as long as you know the law and you stand your ground. He said the people who will try to take it won't come with guns. They'll come with suggestions and helpfulness and concerns about what's proper, and he was right about that too." "Beale," Eli said. "Beale and a dozen others before him," she said. "Men who thought that grief and loneliness would make me sell. Men who thought isolation would eventually bring me to my knees." She paused. "It came close sometimes. I won't pretend otherwise. The first winter alone was very hard." He looked at her in the firelight, at the lines of her face that were strong and clear and marked by weather and work and grief and will, and he felt something in his chest that was not sympathy in the diminishing sense of the word, but something deeper, a recognition, a resonance, an understanding of exactly what it had cost her to be exactly who she was. "I'm glad you held," he said. She looked at him, and in the firelight her eyes were something remarkable, full of things she didn't generally let be seen. "So am I," she said. They sat there for another hour, talking sometimes and silent sometimes, and the silence was the good kind now, the kind that two people share when they are comfortable enough not to fill it. They talked about his ranch in the hill country, about the drought and the bad partnership, and what it had felt like to leave land he had worked for 6 years. They talked about books. They had both read several of the same ones, including a tattered copy of David Copperfield that she had read twice, and he had read once on a long winter in a line camp outside San Antonio. "Did you cry?" she asked, about a particular passage in the book. "I don't admit to things like that," he said, and she laughed, actually laughed, a short, bright, surprised sound that lifted out of her before she could contain it, and he found himself grinning at the sound of it like a fool and not minding at all. When they finally said good night and went to their respective sleeping places, he lay in his bunk for a long time looking up at the dark canvas of the tent ceiling and thinking about the sound of her laugh and the way her face had looked in the firelight, and he recognized the feeling in him for what it was without flinching from it. He was falling in love with Sarah Sawyer. He was also aware that she had lived her whole life being misread and underestimated and presumed upon, and that the worst thing he could do to her was rush. So he held it quietly, the way you hold something fragile, and he kept working, and he was patient. October brought the drive to market. Sarah and Eli and Clem and Jesse took 60 head north to Abilene in 4 days, following the well-worn cattle trail with a competence that made the work feel almost easy. They camped 2 nights on the trail and arrived at the Abilene stockyards on a Friday morning in mid-October to find the pens busy with cattle from a dozen different operations. The negotiations at the stockyard were Sarah's domain, and he watched her operate there with the same quiet attention he brought to everything. And what he watched was impressive. She knew the market. She knew the buyers. She knew exactly what her cattle were worth, and she negotiated without hesitation or apology, and she walked away from the stockyard in the late afternoon with $312 folded into her coat pocket and the expression of someone who had done exactly what they came to do. They celebrated with supper at the best restaurant Abilene offered, which was modest but good, a long wooden building with actual tablecloths. Clem and Jesse ate with the concentration of men who rarely had food prepared for them, and Eli and Sarah sat across the table from each other and talked with an ease and warmth that was different from what it had been 3 months ago, different in every way that mattered. She was wearing a different dress than her usual working clothes. She must have packed it for the occasion, dark blue wool, properly fitted, and her hair was down rather than tied back, falling past her shoulders in dark waves, and she was, quite simply, the most beautiful person he had ever sat across a table from. He was aware that he was staring. He stopped staring. "You did well today," he said. "We did well," she said. "The condition of the herd was the argument, I just made it. You moved the roundup at the right time." "I moved it because you mentioned the grass condition first," she said. "You had already thought of it." "Yes, but you gave me the confirmation I needed to act on it." She looked at him directly across the table, and in the warm light of the restaurant lanterns her eyes were more green than gray. "I'm not used to that. Having someone who thinks the same way I think and confirms rather than complicates. I find it's easier to agree with someone who's usually right," he said. "Don't flatter me," she said, but there was warmth in it, not rebuke. "I'm not flattering you," he said. "I'm agreeing with observable facts. You have been running this ranch successfully for 2 years alone in circumstances that would have defeated most people. Those are observable facts." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not used to being seen clearly," she said. "People either exaggerate what I am in a direction that frightens them, or they diminish what I am in a direction that suits them. You just see what's there." "That's what you do for me too," he said. "So I suppose we're even." She held his gaze, and the something that had been building between them since that first morning in her kitchen was very present now, warm and real and requiring acknowledgement. "Eli," she said, quietly enough that Clem and Jesse, who were deep in a conversation about winter feed, couldn't hear. "Yes," he said. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know what's happening," she said. "I've been pretending for 2 months and I'm tired of it." He was very still. "What do you think is happening?" he said. "I think you care about me," she said, "in a specific way, and I think I'm starting to feel the same, and that terrifies me, and I need you to know it terrifies me before it goes any further." "Why does it terrify you?" he said. "Because I have never known how to be a woman in the way most women are, and every man who has ever wanted me has eventually wanted me to become something I'm not," she said. "And I will not do that. I will not reduce myself for anyone, not even you." "I don't want you to," he said. "I want you exactly as you are. You say that now." "I'll say it in 10 years, he said, and the certainty in his voice was not performance. It was the plain certainty of a man who knows the difference between what he wants and what he thinks he should want. "Sarah, I have spent 3 months watching you, and everything I've watched has made me more sure, not less. I don't want a different version of you. I'm not standing here quietly hoping you'll settle. I want you fierce and loud and right and stubborn and reading by the window and negotiating cattle prices and riding fence in the rain. I want all of it." She looked at him across the restaurant table with the candlelight between them, and her eyes were bright, and she was very still, and he could see the thing in her that was trying to decide whether to believe him. "I don't surrender easily," she said finally. "I know," he said. "I don't need you to surrender, I just need you to trust me a little." The silence stretched between them for a long moment, and then slowly she smiled the real smile, the one she'd almost let him see on the second day, the one that had become more frequent as the weeks passed. It was a smile that transformed her face entirely, that made her look younger and softer without making her look less herself, and he felt it move through him like warm light. "A little," she said. "I can manage a little." They rode back to the Sawyer Ranch the next day in the golden October sunlight, and everything between them had shifted into something that was acknowledged and real, though they moved into it slowly and carefully, the way people who have been hurt move into warmth with gratitude and some remaining caution, but moving, nonetheless. The weeks that followed were among the finest weeks Eli Sullivan had ever lived. The ranch work continued, the fall work of preparation and closing down summer operations and beginning the long management of the winter season. And they did it together now with a partnership that was different in quality from what it had been before, more open, more personal, full of small moments of connection that accumulated like warmth. He would come in from the barn in the evening to find her at the stove, and she would hand him a cup of coffee without looking up from what she was doing, and the ease of it, the naturalness of it, was something he had not felt in his life before. He would sit at the kitchen table while she finished cooking, and they would talk about the day, about the cattle, about the book she was reading, about the letter from a cousin in Ohio who had asked if she was ever going to come east, and she had written back to say absolutely not, with affection. She was funny, deeply and unexpectedly funny, and her humor came at unexpected angles. She would say something absolutely dry and absolutely devastating about a situation, and then look at him with those gray-green eyes perfectly innocent, and he would laugh and she would allow herself a small, satisfied smile. He read to her sometimes in the evenings from her books, if her eyes were tired from a long day in the bright autumn sun, and she would sit in her chair with her hands in her lap and listen with the same absolute stillness she brought to reading herself. He had a good voice for reading, low and clear, and she told him so without embarrassment. "My father used to read to me," she said one evening, after he had finished a chapter and set the book down. "I haven't had anyone read to me since he died." "I'll read to you whenever you like," he said. She looked at him from her chair across the fire-lit room. "I think I'm in love with you," she said, in the same tone she would have used to report the condition of the North Pasture, direct, factual, slightly surprised by herself. He set the book down carefully. "I know I'm in love with you," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up with the first real breath of November, moving around the corners of the house in long, smooth gusts. "What do we do about that?" she said. "What do you want to do about it?" he said. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've never been here before." "Neither have I," he said. "Not like this." "I thought you were engaged once," she said. She had heard that from somewhere, probably Mrs. Gruber, who knew everything. "I was," he said. "It wasn't like this. That was two people who were appropriate for each other but not right for each other. This is different." "How is it different?" He thought about it. "That was comfortable," he said. "This is true, and true is harder and better." She was quiet for another long moment, and then she rose from her chair and crossed the room and sat beside him on the bench by the fireplace, and she looked at him very close for the first time, close enough that he could see the fine lines around her eyes and the particular way the firelight moved in her gray-green irises, and he stayed very still because she had come to him, and the rightness of that was something he wanted to honor. She reached up and touched his face with one hand, the calloused, capable, honest hand of a woman who had worked hard all her life, and she held it there against his jaw for a moment, just looking at him, as though she was verifying something she needed to be sure of. "All right," she said quietly. "All right." And then she kissed him, and it was as direct and honest as everything else about her. A real kiss from a real woman who had decided something and meant it. And he put his hand over hers where it rested against his face and kissed her back. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was one of the harder winters in the Kansas plains. Not catastrophic, not like the terrible winter of 1886 that would come later and break so many operations, but genuinely difficult, with 3 major snowstorms, extended cold that froze the water troughs repeatedly, and a sustained period of gray sky and wind that ground at people's patience and spirits. They managed it together, Sarah and Eli and Clem and Jesse, working the winter rhythms of the ranch, feeding, maintaining, monitoring the herd through the cold with the constant vigilance that cattle through a hard winter require. It was during the first big snowstorm in December, when they were snowed in for 3 days, and the whole world outside the windows was white and howling, that Eli proposed. They were at the kitchen table on the second morning of the storm. The stove was going at full capacity, and the house was warm, and the wind outside was making the sort of noise that reminded a person of how small and precious a warm house was against the scale of the world. Clem and Jesse were in the bunkhouse, which was well insulated and solid and perfectly adequate for the duration. Sarah was mending a pair of canvas trousers. Eli was oiling a piece of tack. It was a quiet, domestic scene, deeply unremarkable, and it struck him with complete certainty that this was exactly what he wanted, exactly this, precisely this woman at this table in this storm. He put down the tack. "Sarah," he said. She looked up. She read something in his face that made her go still. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because this ranch needs a man, because it doesn't. Not because I think you need taking care of, because you don't. Because I want to spend my life next to you. Because you're my equal in every way I respect, and you make me a better man, and a world that has you in it at a distance is significantly worse than a world in which you're close enough to argue with me. I love you, Sarah Sawyer. Completely. I'm asking if you'll have me." She looked at him for a long, long time, and outside the wind howled its white highway across the frozen prairie of Kansas, and the stove ticked, and the lamp on the table cast its warm circle of light, and Sarah Sawyer set down her mending and looked at the man across from her with everything she was. "Yes," she said, "on one condition." "I thought you didn't negotiate conditions," he said. "I'm revising that policy," she said. "The condition is that this ranch stays mine, in my name. That doesn't change." "I wouldn't want it any other way," he said, and he meant it so completely that it was evident in every line of him. She rose from the table and crossed to him, and he stood up, and she took his face in both hands this time and looked at him very seriously. "I love you," she said. "That is not something I say lightly." "I know," he said. "Neither do I." She kissed him again, and this time there was nothing tentative in it. It was the kiss of 2 people who have decided each other, wholly and without reservation. The storm blew for another day and a half, and by the time it cleared and the world outside emerged white and crystalline and blazing with reflected light, something new had been built inside the walls of that house. They were married in the spring, on a Saturday in April of 1880, at the small church at the end of Dusty Creek's Main Street. It was not a large wedding. Neither of them wanted a spectacle. Mrs. Gruber was there, and Otto Crane, and Clem and Jesse, who had both put on their best shirts and looked both uncomfortable and deeply pleased. The widow Callahan, whom Sarah had defended from the card cheat the previous year, brought a cake. Even the postmistress attended. Hector Beale was not there, and no one missed him. The preacher was a young man named Reverend Ford, who was new enough to the town to know the story only vaguely, and he performed the service with warmth and competence. When he asked if there was any impediment to the union, there was a brief moment when everyone present seemed to hold their breath collectively, as if half expecting Russell Greer to appear in the doorway, and then the moment passed and no one said anything, and the Reverend continued. Sarah wore a dress she had made herself over the winter, ivory cotton with small blue flowers in the fabric, and her hair was down, and she stood in the white morning light of the church doorway and looked at Eli waiting at the front of the church and felt something that she would not have known how to name a year ago but knew now as clearly as she knew the survey lines of her own land. It was the feeling of being known and being chosen and choosing back. It was the feeling of standing in your own life and finding it, against all expectation, large enough to contain you. Eli watched her walk toward him and felt his heart make a move in his chest that was so physical and so sudden that Jesse, standing beside him, gave him a sideways look. They said their vows clearly and directly, the way two direct people would, and they put on each other's rings of plain gold bands that Eli had ordered from a jeweler in Abilene. And the Reverend pronounced them married, and Eli kissed her with great gentleness, and some restraint given that Mrs. Gruber was watching with an expression of complete satisfaction. Outside the church afterward in the April sunlight, with the cottonwoods putting out their first pale leaves and the smell of spring grass on the warm wind, Clem shook Eli's hand, and then took his hat off and held it to his chest, and looked at Sarah with the straightforward affection of a man who had served her for 3 years and respected her without reservation. "Your father would be glad," he said simply. Sarah reached out and pressed the old cowboy's arm with her hand, and she didn't trust herself to speak for a moment, but the gratitude in her face said everything. The spring of 1880 was busy in the way that all springs on a cattle ranch are busy, and they moved through the work of it together in the easy, practical partnership that they had built over the previous months, now with the added dimension of being properly home to each other in every sense. Eli moved his few belongings from the bunkhouse to the main house, where he already spent most of his non-working hours, and the house settled into the new arrangement as though it had been waiting for it. He painted the porch that spring, which had needed it for years. Sarah planted new varieties in the kitchen garden, including a section of herbs she had ordered from a catalog, and he built her proper raised beds for them out of boards he'd cut from a fallen cottonwood by the creek. Small acts of care for a shared life, the material language of love in its most enduring form. The matter of Russell Greer and the water dispute came to a head in the summer of 1880, as they had both known it eventually would. Greer, emboldened perhaps by the change in the ranch's situation, made a formal claim with the county land agent that the survey of 1871 had been incorrectly rendered, and that the water rights to the north branch of Pigeon Creek should be readjudicated. It was Eli who suggested bringing in a surveyor from Topeka, and Sarah who organized it, riding into Abilene to send the necessary letters and paying the surveyor's fee from the ranch accounts. The surveyor arrived in August, a meticulous and apparently impartial man named Marcus Webb, who spent 2 days walking the creek boundary with a transit level and a set of detailed notes. His conclusion was exactly what Sarah had always said it was. The 1871 survey was accurate. The eastern bank of the north branch of Pigeon Creek was Sawyer land to the water line, and had been since the original title transfer. Russell Greer's claim was dismissed by the county land agent in a letter that was, by the standards of county land agents, relatively blunt. Greer did not speak to them after that, which both Sarah and Eli considered an entirely acceptable outcome. The summer of 1880 was good in every sense that mattered. The herd was healthy and growing. The ranch was producing well. The fall roundup was better than the previous year, with stronger cattle and better prices, and they came back from the Abilene stockyard with $420 and a sense of momentum that felt solid and earned. And in the early days of October of 1880, Sarah told Eli quietly at the kitchen table in the morning that she believed she was expecting. He was quiet for a moment, and then he looked at her across the table with an expression that was full of something so unguarded and uncomplicated that she felt it move through her like a warmth. "Are you all right?" he said, because he always asked about her first. "I am," she said. "I think I'm surprised mostly. I hadn't been certain it would happen for me." "Are you glad?" he said. She considered it honestly, which was the only way she considered anything. "Yes," she said, "I am." "Are you?" "More than I know how to say properly," he said. She smiled. "Then just say it," she said. "I'm so happy, Sarah," he said. "I'm so genuinely, completely happy." The pregnancy changed the nature of the ranch work somewhat, which was a practical adjustment that Sarah managed with her characteristic directness. She continued working at full capacity through the autumn, and reduced her heavier physical work in the winter months when the cold made everything more demanding. She was not a woman who allowed herself to be fussed over, but she did accept Eli's quiet attentiveness with more grace than she might have managed a year earlier. He was attentive without being smothering, present without being hovering, which was the particular gift of a man who understood what she needed. He did more of the heavy lifting without making a ceremony of it. He made sure there was always wood by the stove and water in the house. He sat with her in the evenings and read to her when she was tired. And when she was not tired, he debated cattle prices and land policy with her with complete equality of engagement. Clem and Jessie received the news with the slow warmth of men who had been part of something long enough to feel invested in its continuation. Clem went so far as to begin, without any discussion, building a cradle in the evenings in the bunkhouse from a piece of walnut he had been saving for 2 years for a purpose he hadn't yet identified. It was a beautiful thing, smooth-sided and solid and rocking cleanly on its curved base, and he brought it to the house on a February morning with his hat in his hands and set it down inside the front door without a word. And when Sarah looked at it and then looked at him, he turned red in a way that was entirely charming. "It's just something to do in the evenings," he said gruffly. "It's beautiful, Clem," she said. "I'm glad it'll be used," he said, and put his hat back on and went back to work. The baby was born on a morning in late June of 1881, with the help of the midwife Mrs. Hollister, who had been delivering babies in the Dusty Creek area for 15 years. It was a long labor, and Eli spent most of it on the front porch alternately sitting and walking, because Mrs. Hollister had made clear in polite but absolute terms that men were not useful in birthing rooms and should go find something else to do with themselves. He was still on the porch when Mrs. Hollister opened the front door at just past 8 in the morning and told him he had a son. The baby was born healthy and had, according to Eli's deeply biased assessment, the clearest eyes he had ever seen on anyone, a dark, considering blue that would likely change but which at this particular moment looked at his father's face with an expression that seemed inexplicably certain. Sarah was exhausted and radiant and held the baby with the same sure competence with which she held everything, already speaking to him in a low, direct voice as though explaining the ranch layout. "His name," Eli said from the doorway. "Joseph," she said without hesitation, "for my father." He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his son, and the feeling in him was so complete and so vast that it had no adequate name in English or any other language, but it settled in him like something permanent, like land. "Joseph Sullivan," he said. "Joseph Sawyer Sullivan," she said, and looked at him to see if he would object. "Of course," he said, "both names." She looked at him with love so plain and direct that it was almost like looking at sunlight. "You're a good man, Eli Sullivan," she said. "You're a remarkable woman, Sarah Sawyer Sullivan," he said. "I knew it from a telegram." She laughed, that bright, surprised laugh that had been one of the first real things about her that he had fallen in love with, and the baby stirred at the sound, and outside the Kansas morning was blazing with summer gold. Word traveled through Dusty Creek and the surrounding territory with the speed particular to small communities, and by afternoon the widow Callahan had appeared at the door with a covered dish of food, and Mrs. Gruber had appeared not long after with another, and even Otto Crane from the livery stable stopped by to look at the baby from what he clearly considered a respectful distance, and to shake Eli's hand with the fierce sincerity of a man expressing feelings he has no words for. Hector Beale sent a brief, stiff note of congratulation that Sarah read once and then set on the shelf and did not particularly think about again. Some things closed without drama, which was its own kind of resolution. The years that followed the birth of Joseph Sawyer Sullivan were the years in which the Sawyer Ranch, which they had taken to calling the Sullivan and Sawyer spread in the county records, though everyone locally still called it the Sawyer place, grew into something more substantial than either of them had individually imagined. They added 160 acres in 1882 when a neighboring property came available through the land office, extending their holdings along the creek to give them access to a year-round water source that reduced their dependence on the seasonal creek branches. They expanded the herd gradually and carefully, the way people who understood cattle expanded not at the pace of ambition, but at the pace of land and grass and water, which was the only pace that made sense. Eli took on additional responsibilities as the operation grew, managing the hired hands. They had 4 full-time hands by 1883, young men from the area who worked hard and were paid fairly and who were, to a man, quietly in awe of Sarah, and overseeing the expansion of the barn and outbuildings. He had a gift for managing people that was grounded in the same fundamental quality that had made him able to stand beside Sarah Sawyer from the beginning, the gift of seeing people as they were, without projection or imposition. Sarah continued to run the financial and strategic core of the operation, which was where her instincts were sharpest, and she continued to be the person who rode out first on fence checks and who negotiated the cattle sales in Abilene and who knew every inch of the land they held. She had also, gradually and at her own pace, become something of an institution in Dusty Creek, not the institution Hector Beale had tried to make her, something cautionary and problematic, but something quite different. A rancher of recognized skill and integrity, a woman whose opinion on cattle, land, and water rights was sought by people who had once been uncomfortable with her. This transformation had not occurred because Sarah had softened. She was as direct and as fierce, and as uncompromising on matters of principle as she had always been. It had occurred because the community around her had slowly, imperfectly, begun to catch up to what she had always been, helped along by the visible fact of her success and the quiet but unmistakable backing of a husband who refused to stand in front of her and insisted on standing beside her. They had their disagreements, because 2 strong-willed people who each hold clear opinions about most things will always have disagreements, and because neither of them was the kind of person to paper over a conflict with false agreeableness. Their arguments were direct and sometimes heated and always resolved, because they both operated from the same fundamental commitment to honesty, and honesty, it turned out, was the most effective conflict resolution tool there was. She was right more often than he was, in his estimation, which he told her once, and she looked at him with great suspicion and asked him if he was trying to flatter her. "I'm making an objective assessment," he said. "You're very irritating," she said, with a smile that negated the statement entirely. "Only when I'm right," he said, "which is less often than you think," she said. "More often than most," he said. "Fine," she said, "split the difference." "I can live with that," he said. Their second child arrived in the winter of 1883, a girl, born in December, whom they named Clara after Eli's mother, a choice that moved him more than he expected when Sarah proposed it. Clara came into the world with the same determined energy as her mother and the same calm intensity as her father, and from very early displayed a combination of both that was, as Clem observed from the comfortable position of a man who had watched both her parents for years, going to be extremely formidable in approximately 15 to 20 years. Joseph by this point was 2.5 and had begun the systematic investigation of the ranch property that would occupy most of his childhood, with particular interest in the horses, the dogs, and the machinery of daily ranch life. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's steady temperament, and already had the quality, remarkable in a toddler, of watching things very carefully before deciding what to do about them. Christmas of 1883 was the first Christmas in the history of the Sawyer Ranch when the house was full. Eli's sister, who was married to a schoolteacher in Missouri, had come west for the first time, bringing her husband and their daughter, a girl of 5 named Josephine, who looked at the ranch with the total wonder of a city child encountering a genuine working farm for the first time. They were warm and easy guests, and Sarah took to Eli's sister, whose name was Margaret and who had his same quality of direct, undemonstrative kindness, with the openness that she gave to most people she genuinely respected. They had Christmas dinner around the expanded kitchen table, which Eli had built a leaf extension for specifically for the occasion, and there was ham and preserved vegetables from the summer garden, and a pie that the widow Callahan had contributed from across the village. And the house was warm with firelight, and the noise of multiple conversations, and the particular cheerful chaos of small children and the smell of good food. Eli looked down the table at his wife, who was laughing at something Margaret had said, the baby asleep against her shoulder, Joseph attempting to feed a piece of bread to one of the dogs under the table, Clem and Jessie at the far end, engaged in a slow, comfortable argument about something involving cattle prices, the snow falling soft and thick outside the windows, and the lamp making its warm circle over everything. Sarah caught him looking and raised her eyebrow. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just looking." She shook her head with the expression that meant she saw through him completely, which she always did, and went back to her conversation with Margaret, and the smile stayed on her face, the real one, the one that had been more frequent with every passing year, the one that made her look like the most beautiful person in any room she was in. By the spring of 1884, 5 years after Eli Sullivan had ridden north from Laredo on the strength of a telegram that had made him something between amused and angry, the Sullivan and Sawyer spread was one of the most successful cattle operations in the Abilene area. Not the largest, there were bigger operations run by men with more capital and less sense, but one of the most consistently productive and well-managed. Their cattle were known for their quality. Their water management had become something of a model that other ranchers came to discuss. They had paid off the mortgage on the original land that Sarah's father had carried, and the deed now sat in the strongbox in the house, clear and unconditional. Hector Beal had sold his operation in 1882 and moved to Kansas City with his daughter and Carl, who had found the ranching life not entirely to his taste. The land he had sold had been parceled and resold, and one of the parcels had been bought by a young family from Illinois who were good neighbors. Russell Greer still operated his ranch 2 ridges over, and he and Sarah existed in a state of careful, non-hostile distance that both sides seemed to find entirely workable. He no longer came to the South Gate to argue about water rights. In the summer of 1884, Sarah was offered the position of County Commissioner's representative for the Eastern District, an unpaid advisory role, but a recognition of standing and contribution that would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier. She and Eli talked about it for several evenings, turning it over with the thoroughness they brought to all major decisions. "It would take time from the ranch," she said. "We have the hands to manage without your constant presence," he said. "We've built that deliberately." "You think I should take it," she said. "I think you're the best qualified person for it in the district," he said. "I think the people of this district would be well served by having your particular brand of honesty and competence involved in its management, but it's your decision. It would mean going into town regularly, meetings, politics. You've never been afraid of conflict," he said. "Politics is a different kind of conflict," she said. "Yes," he said, "but the basic skill is the same. Know the law, stand your ground, be right." She looked at him with the small, fond exasperation that was one of his favorite of her expressions. "My father said something like that to me once," she said. "Your father was a smart man," Eli said. She took the position. She served in it for 3 years, and she was, as Eli had predicted, very good at it. She was not a politician in the smooth, accommodating sense of the word, but she was exactly what the Eastern District needed: someone who understood the practical realities of land and water, and the daily demands of making a life on the prairie, who could not be flattered into bad decisions and would not be pressured into unfair ones. She won a small but significant victory in the 2nd year of her service, when she pushed through a revision of the county water rights policy that established clearer protections for smaller landowners against the encroachment of larger operations. The kind of clear-eyed practical reform that doesn't make headlines but changes actual lives. The widow Callahan, who was now 74 and increasingly frail, heard about the water rights policy from Mrs. Gruber, and the next time she saw Sarah in town took her hand in both of hers and held it for a long time without speaking. Joseph Sullivan grew into a serious, curious, capable boy who was, as Clem had once predicted, very good with horses. By the age of 7, he could handle most of the gentler ranch horses with a competence that impressed even his mother, and he followed both his parents around the ranch with the serious attention of someone learning a trade. He asked a great many questions, most of them good ones. He had his mother's directness and his father's patience, and the combination produced a child who listened carefully and then acted decisively, which was a quality both his parents recognized and encouraged. Clara was less interested in cattle and more interested in everything else. She approached the world with an irrepressible energy and curiosity that kept her parents in a state of affectionate exhaustion. She was cheerful in the way that very confident people are cheerful, without the anxiety that often underlies cheerfulness in people who are less sure of themselves. And she had learned at a very young age that her mother was the finest person she knew, which shaped her sense of what a woman was in ways that would take years to fully manifest. They had a third child in 1886, another son, born in March, whom they named William, after a friend of Joseph Sawyer Sr. who had helped him establish the ranch in the earliest days. William was a round, good-natured baby who slept well and ate enthusiastically, and regarded his older siblings with the uncomplicated adoration of the youngest child, and Joseph took his role as older brother with remarkable gravity for an almost 5-year-old. The terrible winter of 1886 came that year, the winter that broke so many cattle operations across the plains, with blizzards of historic severity and cold that lasted from November until March with barely a thaw. They lost cattle, as everyone did, but they lost fewer than most, because Sarah had spent the previous autumn arguing correctly that the summer had been too wet and the grass too lush, and that a hard winter was coming, and they had reduced their herd size and increased their winter feed stores accordingly. Other ranchers who had not made these preparations came to her afterward and asked how she had known. She told them she had been watching the grass and the weather pattern for 20 years, and that the signs had been clear enough if you knew what to look for. She told them this without any "I told you so," because she was not that kind of person, but she did suggest, in her precise and direct way, that they might consider her analysis next time she offered it. Eli, who had spent 3 months of that winter in the thick of the hardest cattle management work of his life, came through it with a deep and tired appreciation for the woman he had married. She had kept them afloat through the hardest natural test their operation had faced, not through luck but through the specific knowledge and foresight that she had been building for her entire life, and the understanding that this was what she had always been. This capable, this farsighted, this fiercely committed to this land was something he held with gratitude every single day. One evening in the early spring of 1887, when the worst of the winter was finally breaking, and the first thin blades of new grass were starting to push up through the frost-damaged soil of the pastures, Eli and Sarah sat on the front porch of the house, as they often did in the evenings when the day's work was done, and the children were inside. The sun was going down in the west in a long, slow blaze of orange and rose, and the prairie was vast and quiet and beginning to smell of green things again, the smell of potential and renewal that had always meant spring to people who worked land. Sarah had her feet up on the porch railing and a cup of coffee in her hand, and her hair was loose from its usual knot, falling over her shoulder, and she was looking at the sunset with the private, attentive expression she had when she was simply being still in the world and letting it be beautiful. "Do you ever regret it?" Eli asked. She turned her head and looked at him. Regret what? She said. Coming north in response to a ridiculous telegram, she said, smiling, and making a life that includes considerable mud and a great many cattle and 3 children, and a wife who was described as too fierce for any man in the territory. Which she was not, he said. Which she was not, she agreed. He shook his head slowly. The day I read that telegram was the best day I'd had in years, he said. Not because of anything romantic, I didn't know you yet. It was because something about it made me angry in a way that felt important. The idea that a person could be reduced to a problem to be solved. That the wrong thing about the situation was the woman and not the men who couldn't manage her. And now, she said. Now I know you, he said. And knowing you is the most extraordinary thing that has ever happened to me. She looked at him for a moment with those gray-green eyes that he had been reading for 8 years now, and that still, regularly, said things that surprised him. She reached across and put her hand in his, lacing her fingers through his with the easy, certain grip of someone who has been holding this particular hand long enough that it is simply part of the landscape of their days. I was so angry when I found out about that telegram, she said. I knew Beale had sent it. I knew what it meant, that they had decided I was the problem rather than their own limitations, and I was prepared to send you away the moment you rode up that lane. I know, he said. What stopped me, she said, was that you looked at me and you were not afraid, not a little afraid, not patronizingly brave, just genuinely, completely unafraid, and I had never in my adult life met a man who was simply not afraid of me. You're not frightening, he said. I am to men who need women to be small, she said. Then they should have stayed home, he said. She laughed. Yes, she said, they should have. The evening settled around them in the particular deep quiet of the plains at dusk, the last light going golden and then pink, and then the deep, rich purple of a Kansas sky at the edge of night, the first star starting to appear above the horizon, the windmill on the hill turning in the faint, warm evening breeze. From inside the house came the sounds of the children, Joseph's voice explaining something to Clara with great seriousness, William's intermittent burble of commentary, Clem's voice responding from somewhere near the kitchen, and the whole warm, complicated, living sound of a house that was full. Sarah leaned against Eli's shoulder, which she did sometimes in the evenings when the day was long enough behind them to allow the particular luxury of leaning, and he put his arm around her and they sat together in the last of the light, looking out at the land they had built together. The straight fence lines running through the grass, the healthy pastures, the good barn, the well-kept house, the gardens beginning to green at the edges after the winter's damage. The whole 460 acres of it solid and real and theirs. What Hector Beale had intended to be a problem had become a partnership. What the territory had called too fierce had turned out to be exactly right. What a telegram had sent north had found its way home, not to a smaller life or a more manageable woman, but to the exact, full, genuine truth of 2 people who had been exactly right for each other from the beginning, who had simply needed to be in the same place at the same time for that truth to become evident. Sarah Sawyer Sullivan was not less fierce than she had always been. She was fierce in the service of things worth being fierce for her land, her children, the people who depended on her, the small but real improvements she had made to the county she lived in, and the man beside her whom she loved with the same total, unflinching commitment she brought to everything that mattered to her. Eli Sullivan had long since stopped being the stranger who had ridden up that lane in the early morning light of a July day in 1879. He was the fence that held alongside hers. He was the second cup of coffee on the kitchen table before the rest of the house was awake. He was the voice that read to her in the evenings and the hand she reached for in the dark and the person who knew, without being told, what she needed and when she needed it, and when she needed nothing at all except to be left to her own remarkable self. They were, in the best and truest sense of the word, partners. "Come on," she said eventually, as the dark came fully on and the stars multiplied overhead and the prairie settled into its vast, patient night. "The children will want supper." He rose and she rose with him, and she looked up at him for a moment in the last faint light, this woman who had been described as too fierce for any man in the territory, who had proved every one of those men profoundly and completely wrong, and she kissed him, brief and warm and full of everything. "Send her to me," you said, she told him. And meant every word, he said. She took his hand and they went inside, and the door closed behind them on the dark and the stars and the wind moving across the good Kansas grass, and in the house the lamp was lit and the stove was warm and the children were loud and alive, and the table was set for supper. The Sawyer land held. The Sawyer woman held. And the man who had ridden 600 miles to find out what fierce really looked like had never, not for a single morning of his life since that July day in 1879, regretted a single mile of the ride.